All right. Hi, everybody. We're so glad you're here, however you found us. We are going to get this webinar started pretty quickly. Everyone's going to introduce themselves and tell you what they do. You are able to ask questions as part of the webinar. I will be looking at them, bringing them together and trying to find themes, and then we'll start asking questions at the end. So don't worry if I'm like not getting to it immediately. I do see all of them. I just can't always respond because I will also be tweeting. So if you join us on Twitter, you can see some quotes, and you can also learn how to follow all of our incredible panelists and the work that they are doing. You'll also see a lot more supplemental information probably from Twitter as well. There are 3 handouts that I think should be available to everyone. And afterwards, we always create a blog post on our America Walks blog with like all of the links, a summary, and sort of sharing everything. So if you miss something, don't worry about it. You'll have the opportunity to get it later. So with that, I'm going to disappear and go into back end mode. I'm going to toss it to Mike, who can actually get everything started.
Sure. Thank you, Hannah. So last year was just, the news was all about having an infrastructure bill, what would be in the infrastructure bill, and now we have one. So we are still actually waiting for more detailed guidance from the feds as to allocations of the dollars, but there's a lot of information. We know that there's a lot of interest about how do we as advocates for safer streets, for better climate, for health, for economic vitality, all of those reasons, how do we make sure that money is spent well and not poorly? It's a complex topic in the sense of that there's a lot of information. We're going to take a shot at giving an overview, giving some thoughts and advice to people about how to enter the discussion from where they are, whether it's an advocate or a local elected official or an agency person. And I'm really just joined by 3 great people from 3 great organizations. I'll let them each introduce themselves when it gets to them, but we'll launch with Beth Osborne of Transportation for America. You're on, Beth.
Hi, everybody. I'm Beth Osborne. I'm the Director of Transportation for America, a national nonprofit that is dedicated to creating a transportation system that connects people to jobs and essential services, no matter how they travel, how much money they make, or their physical abilities. And we do our work through direct advocacy and through kind of studying the system and figuring out what's working and what's not working. Sorry about that. I'm going to share with you a handful of slides that show how the IIJA, the new infrastructure bill, where the funding goes, what it's for, and what's available for active transportation. And the reason I'm using slides is I think the scale really matters. You know, the infrastructure bill has a lot of money in it that has nothing to do with transportation. There's really a ton of very exciting funding in here for broadband deployment, for environmental remediation, replacing lead pipes, resiliency, all kinds of things. Transportation is a huge part of it, as you can see, a little more than half. Within the funding for transportation, there's actually just a small portion, 13%, that's not part of the traditional formula programs. Formula programs, of course, being those sorts of programs that go out to a recipient, a state department of transportation, a metropolitan planning organization, or a transit agency, based on a predetermined formula. For roads, it might be based on the number of lane miles or the population of the state and issues like that. You can see in the rest of the pot, a little less than half of it is some competitive grant programs, which we'll talk about. But within those formula programs, there are some exciting new programs, including the carbon reduction program, the Protect program, which is resilience. We've got increases to transportation alternatives, but I am guessing you noticed that those are very small slivers of the pie. The overwhelming majority of it still goes out to some unreformed, pretty status quo formula programs. And that's why one of the biggest points I want to make is you should not look for the program that has your issue named in the title. Every program, particularly the biggest programs, need to be sought after for your priorities as well. If not, we get caught in this situation. You know, we're having to climb out of a pretty big hole after years and years of underspending on active transportation, and in many cases overspending in terms of creating space for automobiles, vehicles, and particularly single occupancy vehicles. And to dig out of a hole, you really need to spend more money on the thing you've been neglecting than on the thing that's been causing problems, but we still tend to do the rest. The deal in this bill was twofold. One is we'll give you some new little programs as long as you leave our big programs untouched. And if you give the agencies maximum discretion, we will deliver. Well, as Mike just mentioned, there was an article in Streets Blog today with a bunch of those states saying, well, yeah, we'll deliver, but not on priorities that we find annoying, like equity. We're not going to focus on that. And many of them are led by folks that don't think active transportation or safety for people outside of a car is of high value. So the point is, we really want you to understand where the funding opportunities are and who is making those decisions. And these resources are made available to you as well. We did a blog post on our Transportation for America blog looking at the funding opportunities. And while we often look at things like transportation alternatives as an important program for funding active transportation, these are all of the formula programs under the power, mostly of the state DOT, but sometimes the MPO as well, that can be used for active transportation. That gigantic slice of the pie, almost half of the pie, that's called the National Highway Performance Program, almost all of it can be used to support active transportation. You know, maybe not when you're spending on a limited access road where bicyclists and pedestrians are not permitted, but every place else. And, you know, we don't want to be robbing the beggar in front of the bank. We want to rob the bank. And the bank is in those top two programs, both of which are fully available for active transportation. Here are some others, and this is not a complete list, but it gives you a sense of, you know, some of the competitive grant programs and even transit programs that can be utilized, something that we should be trying to get. And then we have recently put together some information on the overall number of competitive grants that are available for folks as well, because there's quite a long list. And beyond that, I just want to point out some of the actions we'd like to see USDOT take to make all programs friendlier to active transportation. Implementation is going to matter. This is my final point. This bill is pretty status quo, but there are a lot of authorities that USDOT has had for a long time and has not exercised. And if they do exercise them now, will make a big difference in terms of how active transportation is supported. They can do a better job of publicly tracking and ranking state performance in areas like safety and supporting active transportation. DOT can help states and MPOs measure how well people can move around outside of a car. How many people can get to jobs and essential services by walking or biking? They can require in their documentation around a highway to really model what is needed. We don't look at the fact that when you build a lot of new capacity that you create a lot of demand for automobiles, and then that's used against the active transportation community to say there's no space or money to support our needs. I know America Walks and NACTO have been big leaders in talking about the manual uniform traffic control devices and the importance of getting that right so that's supportive of all travelers. And the last two things I will say is if we're really going to focus on safety, DOT needs to release the 2020 data on crashes, which they have yet to do, months past when they normally do. And they really need to stop saying that the safety problem is everybody's fault but their own, that it's the fault of folks from, you know, who are, you know, traveling on that roadway irresponsibly, or that it's the folks who are manufacturing vehicles. We all have responsibility, and it's probably time that they acknowledge their own, and that will help us a lot to engage in a positive conversation going forward.
Thank you, Beth. Next up is Ken from the League of American Bicyclists, and he's going to focus on the competitive grants and whatever else he wants to focus on. So Ken, you're up.
Yeah, thanks for that great presentation, Beth. And I completely agree that we should be playing offense. We should be going after all of those programs that can fund biking and walking and haven't been used for biking and walking in the past. And one of the things that we can do to play offense better is to take advantage of the opportunities we have. So I'm the policy director for the League of American Bicyclists. We have been around since 1880, and our mission is to lead the movement to create a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. Everyone is very important to us. It's important that we pursue equity in all of our bicycle planning and bike network creation. One of the important things about competitive grants for equity is that a lot of competitive grants go to places with higher capacity, places with higher incomes, places that have had more access to political capital over the decades. So it's really important as we implement this bill and implement competitive grants that there is that equity at the forefront, and hopefully places that have been looked over in the past or underinvested in the past are not left out of this investment. So Transportation Alternatives is the big program that has funded the majority of federal investments in biking and walking since it was created in 1991. It got a big bump in funding from $850 million to $1.4 billion per year, but really that's not enough. Like Beth was saying, we are, throwing small amounts of sand into a large hole. Just in the last fiscal year, there's a $3.8 billion shortfall, so that $3 billion bump in funding over the next 5 years doesn't make up that shortfall. For places that are MPOs with over 200,000 people, they're going to get more control over this money. So if your local MPO, if your local community has tried for Transportation Alternative Grant in the past and it hasn't gotten it, now's a perfect time to take another look at that. Make sure that you are applying for this funding, and then you're building from there using those other programs. Another important win is the Highway Safety Improvement Program, one of those formula funding programs that also has like some competitive aspects sometimes. This is something that biking and walking projects have really struggled to get access to for years. So the bill has a lot of positive provisions that hopefully open up this funding. If a state has 15% or more of its traffic fatalities that are people biking and walking, it has to spend HSIP funding on biking and walking projects, and it has to be 15% or more. That's going to really be hard for some states that haven't funded these projects in the past and don't have the systems that recognize the dangers that people biking and walking face. But the bill also pushes every state to do a vulnerable road user assessment in the next 2 years. So hopefully with the administration's support, we'll see states get on board. The map shows that 50% number comes from a NHTSA funding program that's existed for about 5 years. So if your state is darker in the map on this slide, it's been eligible in the past and will probably be eligible for that HSIP funding in the future. So definitely inquire about it. One of the things that I'm excited about is highway safety grants. This isn't infrastructure. This is kind of the culture and often the education and enforcement ease that there's a lot of interest in people reforming. These got substantial increases. The two major highway safety grant programs got almost $200 million more each year. And one of the things that I think is very promising is there's a non-motorized safety program that got a funding bump, much too small at just under $7 million per year. But there was a change that allows it to fund demonstration projects to show the benefits of infrastructure and traffic safety. Like Beth was saying, we need to recognize the role that road designs are playing in our traffic safety system. And Smart Growth America has done some amazing safety demonstration projects that we hope federal funding will now go to on a wider scale using that ability that was given in the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're also looking forward to the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant program. This is something the administration will need to take action on to get that notice of funding opportunity out. This is generally a Vision Zero oriented program. The US has not been going towards zero and needs to really kind of put its foot in the ground and make a strong course correction to improve traffic safety. So definitely look forward to that grant program. Engage with initiatives like the National League of Cities Safety First Challenge or the Vision Zero Network to make sure that you're prepared to take action when that notice of funding opportunity comes out. Getting close to finally, the RAISE grant program was about $1 billion this year, goes to 1.5 billion. This is a great place to accelerate your planned projects. If you have a Greenway plan that's a 20-year plan and you're in phase 3, this is like a perfect grant program to get your phase 4 or phase 5 funded in a quicker timeline than you might working through those other federal funding programs. So really promising, really cool projects in the last round that I would encourage people to look at and kind of get inspired by. The one I highlight here is from Dixon, Illinois, small town in Illinois, funded 12 million of a $13 million phase for bike ped only bridge. So really cool program that the administration has funded some great projects with. And then as Beth was saying, there's a lot of other funding opportunities. Each of these programs is an asset. Each is something that's going to take time and energy for you to access. But there are more opportunities now than we've had in the past, and we need to be playing offense everywhere we can. And yeah, that's my rundown of programs.
Thank you, Ken. I now want to turn it over to Sindhu from NACTO to give her perspective and let us know who NACTO is as well, Sindhu, for those that may not know.
Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So thank you, Ken and Beth, for that absolutely critical perspective on what the infrastructure bill does and also doesn't do, which is equally important to understand. So my name is Sindhu Bharadwaj. I am the Policy Program Manager for the National Association of City Transportation Officials, or NACTO. We represent 85 cities and transit agencies across the US and create the design and policy guidance tailored to cities, covering how to make streets better for people who are walking, biking, and taking transit. And cities are really in a unique position with respect to this bill in that they'll have more opportunities than ever to apply for federal funding. But as Beth covered, the majority of the funds in the bill are still going to be flowing to states that are free to act in ways that may not align with cities' interests. So ultimately, this bill's success hinges on how states choose to spend those funds and the projects that USDOT will select to receive federal grants. And if implemented well, this bill could really go further than anything that came before it to support good projects and make progress on goals around climate and equity and safety. But getting those good outcomes will really rely on advocates and cities taking action in the 3 ways laid out here. So let's start with design. First, cities need to adopt the design standards that account for the needs of people walking, biking, and taking transit on their streets. So in this picture here, the intersection on the left, you can probably guess that no one would want to walk or bike there. It's dangerous, scary, really inhospitable from all perspectives, and really designed to fail people who aren't driving. But thankfully, it just got easier with this bill to design our streets to look more like the picture that's on the right. The infrastructure bill contains a subtle but crucial policy change that grants cities explicit permission for the first time to use the design guide of their choice when implementing projects that are funded with federal dollars. So this means that cities can finally spend federal funds on projects that are designed for people, even if your state is using different design standards. And up to this point, cities had to defer to states when it came to designing federally funded projects, even when that project was entirely on locally owned streets. So in other words, if you were using federal money, you technically used to be limited to designs like the one shown here, especially depending on what state you were in. And now with the new language in the infrastructure bill, streets like this, one's picture, can be more easily implemented using federal dollars. And in order to take advantage of this change, a city needs to first formally adopt a design guide that they want to use in place of the state requirement. And if you're a city staff person or an advocate who would like to see that change happen, the best action is for your city's chief traffic engineer or equivalent position to issue a memo stating that the Urban Street Design Guide or the NACDO Urban Bikeway Design Guide are the city's standard for the purposes of implementing federally funded projects. And some cities that are on this webinar might have already adopted the guide through a complete streets ordinance or passed by their city council. And if your city is lucky enough to be in that position, you're probably already covered, but can't hurt to issue that internal memo anyway. And then going on to states, while more authority around street design is incredibly important, the infrastructure bill doesn't really do much else to change the relationship between cities and state DOTs. I think we already know that the majority of funds that'll flow as formula funds to states, who retain that control over how and where to spend that money really comes with very few guardrails and isn't really attached to the performance measures that will lead to the safety and climate outcomes that cities and advocates have been asking for. But an important point is that states are and have always been free to pursue policies at the state level and spend their transportation dollars in a way that improves transit, prioritizes safety, and puts roadway maintenance over expansion. But in the absence of federal requirements, state action really is the most powerful tool for making sure that these funds are used to improve safety and climate outcomes rather than making them worse. But of course, states are not necessarily going to take that step themselves, and cities and advocates have big roles to play in making sure that states do better. But the good news is that there are some models of good state level actions that should be replicated around the country. We really don't have to start from scratch to make that change. And if you're a city, there's strength in numbers. So over the last several years, an example is that California's 7 largest cities, all NACDO members, have been coordinating to improve state transportation policy. And this is really powerful. The ability to identify and articulate shared priorities is definitely necessary for getting state legislators to pay attention to the needs and interests of cities. And this strategy has definitely yielded real results and paid off in California. Since 2019, cities have won the authority to lower speed limits on dangerous streets, more easily implement bike and bus lane projects, and they've also been at the forefront of guiding the state's transportation safety strategy. And these changes all came about in the past 3 years because cities in the same state were able to work together. And this is really a model that cities within the same state should be copying to demand similar changes. And there have also been some promising changes that advocates and their allies in state legislatures have initiated. You may have heard that just last month, Colorado DOT adopted a greenhouse gas performance measure that would require new projects to be evaluated based on their climate impacts. And this is exactly the kind of rule every state should be adopting, especially the ones whose leaders claim to care about climate change. And this rule in Colorado came about mainly due to the work of transportation environmental advocates, as well as good state DOT leadership. It does exist. And also initiative on the part of the state legislature. So a real perfect storm of factors there. And advocates should definitely be pressing other states to adopt a similar measure, especially now that there's a model of how it can be done. And then as we've already covered, the infrastructure gives US DOT very little control over how states spend their money, but they still do have a lot of power and can hold states accountable. Something as simple as more transparently tracking where federal transportation dollars go can have a really big impact and draw much needed scrutiny to states' decision making. And that's not just for the sake of transparency. I think our long-term goal here is to make sure that we can make the case for better rules on how federal transportation funds can be used, so that in 5 years, when reauthorization and this bill comes up again, it's common knowledge in Congress and in the media that our formula funding mechanisms are actually undermining our policy aspirations for climate, for safety, for health, and so much more. And that's why NACTO has called on USDOT to publicize the projects that formula funds are paying for, to see whether public money is actually meeting the goals that the administration has specifically laid out for fewer traffic deaths, for better access, lower carbon emissions, and more equity through transportation. And turning to the one big pot of funding USDOT does have complete control over, the discretionary grants. This administration's success really hinges on getting grant funding to good projects that generate the benefits that the administration wants to see. And not only will USDOT have to create strong criteria for choosing good projects, it's really also on them to make cities and others that are eligible for the funding actually able to apply for and use the money. And cities are only going to apply for federal grants if it's worth the time and resources to do so. If half of a project's total cost is going to go towards applying for and administering the funding and grant reporting, cities are going to say no to going after that money. I think USDOT wants these programs to be successful, and therefore they need to hear from cities on what the barriers to applying for and working with federal funds are. NACTO actually put together a series of recommendations to USDOT on how they can structure grant programs to work better for cities and other eligible parties. So for cities considering applying to any of the 20+ new grant programs that were mentioned earlier, make sure that USDOT hears from you on how they can improve and implement these programs. And definitely let NACTO know too, so we can amplify your message and highlight your projects. So I'll close by saying that, this infrastructure bill might lock in transportation funding and policy for the next 5 years, but it's really not too soon to start thinking ahead. This bill certainly falls short when it comes to changing the substance of transportation policy. And, I think we can agree that it enables some of the practices that make our transportation system so unsafe and inequitable. But the decisions around implementation, especially those made by states, can really help ensure that we have some better options in the future. We're already seeing some good progress, and we really see it as our job to accelerate that.
Thank you, Sindhu. That was really great. Waiting for my other folks to come back on camera so we can start doing some Q&A. I just want to say I actually learned a lot from that, and this is my full-time job. So I can only imagine for people watching, that really was a flood of information. I think one of the things that I think I learned here and took away from this is that it's a large sum of money. It's flowing through a whole bunch of different ways, and there's a lot of different ways one can impact it. And that I think that a lot of people, maybe I'm just projecting from myself, really we're focusing on these competitive grants. So what is the grant that has my name on it, so to speak? What's the grant for the bike program or the climate program or safety? And I think one of the really big takeaways here, and really appreciate the practical advice Sindhu was just putting out about the rules about how the money is spent can affect everything, right? Any federal money can be better spent if cities have better rules, for example. So I'm really struck by how many different places someone can enter this discussion from, depending on who they are, what their experience is. So and of course there are different levels of decision making. What we heard was, what grant will your city apply for? What will your local metropolitan planning organization? And for those listening, that's a regional entity that creates a capital project list that is essential for getting federal funding. And then of course the state level, which is a combination of your legislature and state DOT. So with that broad range, and feel free to drill down a little bit, if a community member were coming to you, and maybe they're already active in some way in trying to get safer streets, what would you say to them about, next steps? What's the next practical thing they could do, knowing that they might not be writing the grant application from the city or writing the state law, but they are active, they know other people, and they want to influence stuff? Who'd like to go first on that one? I'll throw that one to you, Beth.
I think the most important thing to do is have a strong vision locally and worry about the resources next. With a good local commitment and a good vision, you can find the resources. What I was trying to show you in my presentation, and I think Ken and Sindhu emphasized as well, is there are tons of places to go for money. And you don't have to stay in one tiny pot. You also don't have to make every active transportation effort its own project. Every single resurfacing program or a project should be an active transportation project. Every time they lay down new paint, that can be an active transportation project. So I think first knowing what you want is really helpful, because then when someone announces on one of the roadways that you have grand visions for, that they're going to be doing a rehab, it's time to make sure your stuff gets in there, or to reach out to the agency that owns that street and say, hey, whenever you bring this up, we're going to expect to see these things. I think in terms of the big bulk of money, the states and metropolitan planning organizations, but overwhelmingly the states, are making those decisions. You don't apply for that necessarily. Most of that money, that National Highway Performance Program money, that half of the pie, that's a decision for the state to make. You don't have to submit an application. So it's about talking to your state legislators. It's about talking to your governor and your local officials to also make that push to say, I want to see our vision, our projects in the state transportation plan. And then if you're going to go write grants, then you're looking to fill gaps, but you're not trying to rehab your whole city with little grants while the big programs are still being used to build roadways that have no active transportation on it.
Ken or Sindhu?
Yeah, I'm the chair of my local MPO's bike ped committee. So what I did recently for them is I went and looked at what we're planning to do and how we can accelerate that. I helped walk them through the various grant programs so that all of the people at the various localities that participate in that committee are aware of them, because many of them don't follow the federal transportation bill process in the way that we do. And then also it is really important to look at what kind of that status quo is being done. In my city, there's an arterial roadway that the city just continues to throw money at and rarely puts in biking and walking considerations as they're doing that. So highlighting that that's happening and that we need to change that, and that this is an opportunity to do that change with this new bill is one of the things that I did for my committee locally.
Sindhu?
Yeah, absolutely endorse everything that was just said. I think in terms of simple logistics, definitely be on the lookout for notices of funding opportunities from USDOT. I think we can expect to see some of those roll out over the next 6 months. And I believe USDOT has already started releasing selection criteria for some of the programs. So it's really important to be able to just comb through the opportunities that you can expect to see in the next couple of months and choose the ones that are the best fit for your city.
I think there's also, I would encourage people, having watched this, and again, all the materials will be shared on our blog. Some of these are in the chat already. I think there's an opportunity, if you have a relationship with the local elected official, to just ask them, like, what's being done here? Just ask the question, what's being done here to position our place for these infrastructure funds? And again, don't limit it just to the grant programs. I was really struck by the design guidelines issue from the state, being able to adopt the NACDO standards. This is one of the biggest issues, is when you go to someone and they say, well, we can't do it that way because the rules require otherwise. That's not so right now, right? If they can adopt NACDO, those can be those design guidelines, that can be pretty good. And then that would affect every federal dollar that flows into that community. And there's probably a lot of federal dollars in a lot of smaller projects in a city as well. You'd be surprised how much goes through, speaking from experience. You know, I think there's also an element of this of sophistication, right? Like, yeah, this is all great advice for big cities that have really, they have dedicated staff to these things. They may even have someone in DC paying attention to transportation policy and people that can write grants, and they have active organizations already. What about the smaller cities and towns that, really could use these types of investments? What considerations should they be thinking about in this process that might be different from how a big city thinks about it? And I'll start with Sindhu, since she's represents city transportation officials.
Sure, I think taking advantage of that new design authority that cities have as a result of this bill is incredibly important. It costs nothing to adopt the NACTO guidance, and in the past, I think a lot of cities, especially smaller ones, were beholden to state requirements when it came to designing their own streets. But now, thankfully, this bill says your streets, your choice. So adopting those guides that are more appropriate for an urban context or even a multimodal context is a huge step that cities of all sizes should be taking advantage of now.
Ken or Beth, additional thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a handful of things we need to do, three main things. One is encourage USDOT to make applying for their funding much simpler. I'd love to see a universal application for all of their programs, one that does not require or encourage you to go set up, get a fancy, consultant to write your application. I know when we go to philanthropy for funding, a lot of times they'll ask a question and they'll say, you have 200 words, you have 500 words, fill it in here. USDOT could do that. They could also set up a more automated way of accepting benefit cost analyses that they require for some bigger projects, something that works more like the tax programs a lot of people rely on, where they say, give me this information and we'll calculate it for you. So I think one is we need to push them at USDOT to recognize what a huge onus it is, particularly on lower income communities and smaller communities to pull down grant money. But also, when your state tells you they can't do something, what they mean is we don't allow ourselves to do it. We have set a policy against doing what you want. And when they blame the feds, they may not know that that changed, because frankly, they don't spend all of their time analyzing federal legislation to figure out what changed. And when they started their job 30 years ago, maybe that was the case. But you should push back and push back hard. And even if your federal highways administrator in your state thinks you can't for federal rule reasons, push back hard on that. Make them show you where it says that, because usually they can't produce it. And sometimes it's a great educational process for them. And then the last thing I'd say is don't go it alone. Partner. Sometimes philanthropy will help you by paying for a grant writer. Sometimes if you've got a university in the area, even if it's not in your town, they will give you students that can help you. I know of grant applications that were put together and an economics student wrote the benefit cost analysis and got credit for it. There's help out there. Sometimes businesses that benefit from your work will also help you by writing some of these grant applications. So don't just push through and suffer through. Look for those partners, and those very partners will help make your application more competitive, just because you can show there are other people excited about what you want to do.
Ken?
I think that's a lot of great information. Definitely push back, bootstrap your own planning. If you have a project, you have a dream about making biking and walking better in your community, do it, kind of put it on paper, draw other people to it. It's never been easier to make mock-ups in Google Slides, or mark up a Google map, or take your camera out there on your phone and show how bad it is to bike and walk around your community and how unsafe it feels. So it's a great time to use the new bill, use the new administration's kind of pushes around traffic safety and other things, as empowering you to speak more forcefully and make people show you where you can't do that.
Yeah, endorse all of that. One of the things, and Beth and I were talking about this previously, you know, I've been from Washington for many, many years now, that state of Washington, and the Constitution says that gas tax can be spent for highway purposes only. I even hear local advocates thinking, therefore, that can only be spent on freeways. In fact, the very definition in the Constitution says roads, bridges, anything that affects travel. And in fact, loads of money has been spent on bike and ped infrastructure. So there's kind of this belief that the state can only spend money on certain things, and really pushing back against that is worth it. And asking, what's the authority? What does it really say? And being able to, and I bet you there may be some people, I don't want to spur too many emails, but I bet you there are some people at our level who, if you sent a question to us, might be able to help you out if you start running into those things. You know, the other issue that I think is really an important one that was mentioned earlier by Sindhu is the role of the traffic engineer in making decisions in places. And again, from personal experience, I saw how much things changed when as mayor of Seattle. We get different traffic engineers over the years. What do you do? What do you do when you have the traffic engineer who just doesn't really believe that we can do these things? How do you, what's your advice, if any, on that? Sindhu, I keep going to you since you're the city transportation official person, may know more about that. So
Sure. Well, I think the good thing about the NACTO network is that if there's something your city wants to do, there's probably a city out there that's already done it. And having that proof of concept is really powerful for pushing back against the naysayers in your city. You know, if they say that something can't be done and you're able to show them an example of a city that's already done it and a city that's been successful having implemented a project like the one you're out for, you know, I don't think there's any better counter argument than that.
Canada.
Agree more with that, and you'll often find that it can be the case even within your own state. You know, Ken mentioned some demonstration projects we've worked on, and we tend to do a cohort from one state, 3 different communities, and they're designed to pull in the different district offices from your state DOT. One of the things we've discovered repeatedly is they apply the rules differently. And it's quite a statement when you find out that your state DOT has been telling you for years that you can't do something that same state DOT allows another community to do. And it's an accident. A lot of the times they just are not internally accurate, but it triggers a bit of an emergency conversation within them. Of how to fix things. So having those cohorts like you get through organizations like you see here so that you can put out the word and learn that other communities have been successful on that thing, and then allowing them to come to you where you've been successful is an incredibly powerful tool.
Hannah?
Strongly support statewide organizing. And if you're in like a community that like is somewhat skeptical of things that have city in their title, like the NACTO guides, the FHWA guides are actually really good for rural areas, for bikeway selection. Like FHWA has some really good guidance out there on biking and walking that should be used if your city is at all skeptical of NACTO guides or other guides.
Hannah, let us know. Should we be I can't see all the questions, so.
Ooh, there are a lot.
Okay.
All are ready. Also, I want to say real quick, if you haven't checked the chat yet, I dropped a bunch of links into the chat to a lot of these resources. So everyone has access to a lot of the visuals and a lot of the links just for your alt-tabbing pleasure. Now, so one question that we're getting a lot, or some version of that I would love to hear, and you talked about it a little bit, but I would love to go into it a little more. What about very small towns? What about counties? What about, you know, folks who maybe don't have the infrastructure, maybe they might not even have a traffic planner, or like they have, you know, are sharing it across a wide range. And so there's a real question about how, if you live somewhere rural, is it better to go straight to your state representative, or like sort of how do you get this kind of thing moving, since we also know that small towns are disproportionately impacted by things like not having sidewalks. So I would love to hear that. I think that would help a lot of people in the chat. Oh, and I'll assign, actually, let's start with Beth.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was just having a conversation about a little town in Louisiana trying to put in some crossings and some sidewalks. And the state DOT told them that they would have to pay for a traffic study and handle all the match. Of course, they didn't ask that little town to do the traffic study and handle the match when they rebuilt the road. And so, you know, it's amazing. There's so often policies put in place by the state, often because, oh, but rural areas. That's always the quote, oh, but rural areas, that are some of the most anti-rural policies ever written. Basically, that policy by Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, it says if you're wealthy, you can have these things, and if you're not, you may not. So I think that first step is making sure your local officials, your local mayor is really on board. And I definitely think what Hannah referred to about going to seek help from your state representative and the folks who represent you in the state house and the state legislature is critical. We don't utilize those folks enough, but they're the ones that oversee and appropriate on behalf of the state DOT. So they matter a lot. And I think there's no universe where little towns or under-resourced counties are going to take this on by themselves. So we've got to find a way to get the state DOT in the room and collaborating with you. And that's going to require political pressure to make it happen. So go and get all of your politicians, pushing them to answer those questions and get them in the room. I mean, even just if you get agreement or get a grant, your little town isn't going to want to do all the compliance. You're not going to want to run the RFP to do the construction or manage the grant. So you need the DOT in there. Come up with your vision, get your political partners on board, and then charge in and get DOT to help you implement it. And I'll say one other thing. Mike pointed out the constitutional prohibitions. His point is right. They're more broad than people like to believe, but also, you know, their constitutions don't permit gas taxes to be spent on healthcare either. We don't say, oh, well, then I guess we don't fund healthcare. So to some extent, okay, there's a constitutional prohibition, then go do your job and find the money. And I think we need to be much more aggressive. If you want to hobble yourself, great, but do your job and come up with the money to do things that are critical to safety.
It's such a great point of it being a political question and the need to find a champion at the state level. I mean, oftentimes on many issues, you know, you can build a great community coalition, but until you actually have a champion in that arena to hold others accountable, it can be really hard to make progress. So finding a champion, building the coalition that makes a champion come in. Part of the problem may be that your local elected officials already are championing something in your district and it's not what you want, right? It may be the new interchange or something like that. So I realize that's a difficult problem. But that's kind of what you kind of have to get your thing on the list too, at least, if they already are being champions for something else. That's my thought or observation from having been a politician for a few years. Hannah, next up, other thoughts? I don't mean to interrupt Sindhu or Ken if you want to jump in on that one.
I wanted to add one thing on that local match point that Beth brought up. There are provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure law that give more flexibility in that local match. So if your community doesn't have that local match, you can use that highway safety improvement program funding to match your transportation alternatives grant funding. So don't let that hang you up if that's been a sticking point in the past. There's new flexibility there, and that needs to be publicized.
Go for it, Hannah. Are you muted?
Always. I'm a hypermuter. Okay, related to what Ken just said, there is some confusion about like where does that flexibility come from? Do you have a like folks want to see like where it says like cities have more flexibility in design now, and there's a little bit of confusion that doesn't seem super clear. So can you clear that up real quick?
I don't know that site offhand. It's a
Sindhu?
large
That about
bill.
the design flexibility. So that's section, I think it's 11129 in the bill. And I believe Hannah shared a link in the chat to an overview of the infrastructure bill that NACTO put together. And that document contains a lot of relevant information and the section citations in the bill for different policy changes and programs that could be useful to cities as they navigate all this.
We'll make sure we call that out in the blog post too then.
And that language made it explicit. But again, let me be clear, there was no prohibition against any of this before. It is state policy to, they have, when they say we can't, the translation is, we have chosen to tie our hands with some internal memo because we don't wanna. So don't let them out of it. Say, oh, you can't, then fix it so you can.
And then one other question that we got that I thought was interesting or worthwhile, how does this infrastructure bill sort of intersect with like ADA upgrades or, the kinds of like accessibility changes that people might want to see in their areas? Like, Ken, you were talking like if you have a green belt that you're working on, this pot of funding could really help push you over. I'm curious, is there something like that related to accessibility, or is there a way that folks can use this funding to help them get curb cuts, ramps, that kind of thing?
Almost every dime in this program can be spent on those things. If those things are not being built, it is because it is a policy decision to deprioritize them. The National Highway Performance Program can be used for curb cuts and any kind of ADA accessibility. The Surface Transportation Block Grant Program can be used for all of those purposes. That's 75% of the formula dollars. And almost every other program, the Highway Safety Improvement Program, the Transportation Alternatives Program, almost every one of the competitive grant programs, a good portion of the transit program. It is not an eligibility problem if that is not being prioritized. It is a policy decision that we let state DOTs and MPOs get out of by pretending they need some additional funding. They have gotten a bigger windfall from the federal government through this bill than they have in more than a generation. If they can't find the money now, they couldn't communicate more clearly how unimportant it is to them, and we need to call them out for it.
So, the state of Washington, claps. The state of Washington, as others, is getting, significant new funds. And there's one state legislature who would like to use those funds to eliminate the tolls on a major bridge that is funded by those tolls. They could use that funding to say, we want to fund our active transportation plan or fund the extraordinary amount of money that cities need, but not extraordinary in the scale of what's spent on the federal highway system. It actually starts matching up, but for your typical city budget is very large to retrofit, all of those non-complying sidewalks and places, which you are legally obligated, which cities are legally obligated to do, but they simply don't have the funding source. So again, it is to some great degree a political fight, more than a policy or dedicated funding issue.
Okay, we probably have time for one more quick one, I would say. Okay. I think
Since I lose people on the hour, I'm going to interrupt and then we'll have one more quick question.
Okay.
I just want to say, first of all, because I'm starting to see the numbers tick down as we hit the hour. First of all, we have to give a big thank you to the Centers for Disease Control, which is our partner and helps fund these webinars as part of their Active People, Healthy Nation program. We are funded to support activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. And that's why we support local advocates like this. So big thanks to them, and go to their Active People Healthy Nation site. You can Google it, find it. We'll throw it up in the links, and sign up as an individual or influencer or organization to show your support. We don't think, how our streets are built are more than about moving vehicles or even moving people or bikes. It's about how we build our communities to make them healthy, and the CDC has been actively supporting groups like ours that do that. So thank you. The other thing is, if you enjoy these, think about donating to America Walks. We can do more of them, and we can do more other types of work. And I just want to say, we now have a new enticements, not the water bottle, but the sticker. If you donate, you will get a postcard with this sticker on it. And you too can decorate your laptop and water bottle. The links, americawalks.org/donate. Please support us. We've been getting more and more supporters over this past year, and we want to keep building that. And we want to see those stickers out in the wild. So thank you all for what you do. And I'll turn it back to you, Hannah, for the last question, and then we'll close.
Oh, well, first I'm going to do a plug as well. As the person who also runs America Walks social media at this moment, I would put in a big recommendation to follow us on Instagram. We're at America Walks, and we're always, we do a lot of sharing because people are constantly pointing out pedestrian mishaps and missing curbs and things like that. So tag us in your adventures. And also check out our blog. We have a lot of really good information on americawalks.com, and you'll want to bookmark it because after this, I will be embedding the YouTube video, including a billion links and doing some direct quotes in a big blog post. So you will see a lot of things from this, including several of the quotes from Beth, which people in the questions are really into, by the way. And all of you are invited, it seems, to squinting every small town in America to help out with this kind of organizing. So all of you will have a standing invitation pretty much across the country. So we're getting really great feedback, and thank you to everyone. So last question, I think, really is, are there any parts of this, let's start it on or end it on a high note. Are there any competitive grants or parts to this that you are particularly very excited about? And Ken, why don't you start?
I'm really excited about those demonstration projects. Highway safety grants through NHTSA have funded a lot of things that active transportation advocates don't really love, like pedestrian shaming campaigns that tell people to wear reflective vests and carry lights at night, or just constantly say that the most important thing for bike safety is people wearing bike helmets rather than creating safe bike infrastructure. It's really a great time to engage those traffic safety folks that have put out kind of those negative messages in the past and say, hey, here's the positive vision forward, here's the safe system approach, where we use design and infrastructure to make sure that people are safe, rather than kind of saying that they're on their own and they're to blame if they get injured. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity to have that flexibility so that it can fund demonstration projects. And I think it's going to push highway safety offices that are responsive to the governor per federal law to think differently about what they're doing. And I'm really excited about people pushing on those offices.
Beth or Sindhu, any ones you're particularly excited about?
I'll jump in and say that the Safe Streets and Roads for All program that's in the bill is looking really exciting. It provides, I think, $6 billion over 5 years to fund Vision Zero and equivalent plans and their implementation. And this program is unique because it is exclusively open to local governments. So we finally have a dedicated funding source for the kinds of safety work that cities have already been doing for a long time with much needed federal support now. So very excited to see the programs that come out of that grant.
Beth?
Yeah, I know it's not squarely within active transportation, but we now have a long-term dedicated sizable amount of funding to build out intercity rail. And I'm very excited that we now have put passenger rail on par with the rest of the surface transportation system. I'm very excited that you know what, well, I'll put it this way. One of the opportunities of our failure to get fundamental change within this bill to the core programs is a very aggressive promise by the US Department of Transportation that their implementation is going to blow us away. And I am extremely excited to accept that help and encourage them to make fundamental change to the program that can be lasting no matter what the legislation does. A lot of their guidance has a great power, and I think we've got some folks in place to help. I'm excited by the really extraordinary group of reporters out there these days that are now willing to question the results of this program. I've never seen such a dogged and insightful group of reporters. You know, I started working in this area in the 90s. People who, like, you know, at the LA Times, who has looked at the impact of highway takings, you know, at the Washington Post, who's looked at where they're doing good repairs. I mean, at Laura Bliss, who did a great report recently on, you know, the pushback on the expansion of the highway in Portland. That's going to make the difference. That's going to tell people what we're actually getting and turn the conversation from what we're spending to what we're receiving, what benefits we as taxpayers are really getting. And that sets us up for a very powerful conversation next time we reauthorize the transportation program.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and give a close with an answer to that question, and then we'll wrap. I'm with Beth, I'm with everyone on this one, but I'm totally with Beth on, you know, just in my experience as an advocate, you know, working to get, you know, sidewalks in my neighborhood so I could walk with my kid to the grocery store safely, to today, watching the evolution of the public understanding of this issue, and that's reflected now in all of these articles being written and a greater focus. It's like the public demand is changing. Watching NACDO grow from a small organization to a big one with a totally alternative vision of what city streets and local streets should look like. So I'm excited about that. I'm also excited by some of the state level campaigns and other campaigns I'm seeing, the activism out there. I'm excited to see that Sunrise, which is a climate advocacy organization, has gotten very involved in opposing a highway, particularly for its equity as well as its climate implications in Portland, Oregon. A statewide, and you can look at one of our old webinars on this, heartily recommend this if you're an advocate, on the Disability Mobility Initiative, which is a statewide effort to center the needs of non-drivers and really push the state to do things differently. So I guess this is a tip we should have said, you know, find your local advocacy organization if that's who you are. If you're in government and that's not really what you do, find a way to connect with them and help educate them about the possibilities so that they can do a better job on the outside. You know, and just get engaged, because it feels like things are moving our way, and it certainly feels like they're not moving our way fast enough. They aren't, but again, just big picture level, we've been really making gains. And finally, I just want to announce that our next webinar is Wednesday, March 2nd, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 Pacific, where we're going to have James Rojas, who was the author of Latino Urbanism, and his co-author on a new book about how to invite active participation amongst diverse groups on local community planning. He's really a delightful speaker and a real leader in this area. So look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. Look forward to seeing you get engaged out in your community. You're probably already there, but thank you for doing that. And thank you for joining our webinar. And thanks to our guests, they were great.
Yeah, thank you.